and welcome to the Word with Webb podcast. I'm Eric, and I'm here with the Reverend Dr. Richard Webb.
Howdy.
In this show, we get a chance to nerd out on a variety of biblical topics with Pastor Richard.
We have way too much fun.
Yes, we do. But before we do that, I want to thank you for tuning into this episode and would like to ask you a quick favor. Our mission here at Hope is to reach out to the world around us and share the everlasting love of Jesus Christ. So if you could take a second to rate and review the show and maybe send it to a friend, that's one thing you can do to help reach more people. Also, if you ever have any questions for Richard or topics you'd like to hear discussed on the show, you can submit those by clicking the link in the description. That's linktree.com/wordwithweb. And this is the last episode of this season, season 6.
Yeah.
So kind of going along with that last comment, submitting questions and ideas, we're going to be kind of collecting those over the next couple months.
Yeah.
And so now would be a really good time to submit any questions or suggestions for topics, because those will help kind of inform what we're going to do in season 7.
Yeah. Oh, man, I'm looking forward to that. 7, the number of completion, 7 days, all that stuff.
Yeah.
That does not mean we're going to quit.
No.
It's just a 7.
Yep.
But we were looking back at that, and we have done 6 seasons, which just blows our minds.
Mm-hmm.
And the fact that we're still having fun says we might be onto something.
Yep. Definitely.
And so, yeah, we do love questions because we want to answer questions people are asking, not just the ones we're asking.
Mm-hmm.
So, yeah, definitely bring them in. And think of topics we haven't covered before, too.
Yeah.
So when you're thinking about questions, go there as well.
Yeah, there's a lot of topics we've covered, but there's a lot that we haven't. So, all right. Anything else you want to say before we jump into this topic today?
Let's jump in.
All right. So our title of this episode is Where God Lives, the temple theme throughout Scripture.
Mm-hmm.
Before we get into kind of that title, why this topic? Why do you think this is important to get to understand?
The whole issue of the temple it's like one of the biggest metaphors in all of Scripture. And it's also actual thing, so it's not just a symbol. It has to do with God's character, how God relates to us, even when we rebel. It all finds its climax in Jesus and then moves forward to a second climax in the second coming. And so if we don't understand what the temple is, then we're likely to get a whole bunch of other things skewed.
Mm.
So what the temple is, what it means, and how God works with the temple over time is a very major theme.
Mm-hmm. And this title of Where God Lives is kind of a big, bold title.
Yeah.
Is that something that we're going to, I guess, actually find an answer to, or is that a little bit of a moving target in Scripture?
No, actually, I'll give you the short version right now, and we can get into it more deeply later. In Hebrew, there is no word for temple. There's just house, and so
Okay.
when God has a house, in English it's translated temple. Likewise, tabernacle, if you were to look at the original languages, just means tent.
Hmm.
And so temple and tabernacle are technical terms in English to mean God's house or God's tent.
Hmm.
And which is a very fascinating thing. Now, we will find that the word house shows up indirectly on the way certain things are described, like creation. Creation in the way that it's described in Genesis 1 and 2 turns out to be God's house.
Hmm.
And we can keep on going with that.
Mm-hmm. Interesting. Okay. Well, so I think most people, when they think about temple, they think that's starting with Solomon.
Mm-hmm.
Where would you start this theme?
Right in Genesis 1 and Genesis 2. If you were to take a look at Genesis 1 from a standpoint of a builder, you'd see an orderly construction where the first thing we do is clear the land, get rid of the chaos.
Mm-hmm.
Then we begin to start, and we do a foundation, and then we start putting in the framing, and then we put in the plumbing and the electricity,
Mm-hmm.
et cetera, all the way out to the exterior walls, the interior walls, the appliances.
Mm-hmm.
And then if it's a big enough house, we would have a staff.
Okay.
And then once we're done, we move in, we kick it, watch a soccer game or whatever.
Mm-hmm.
So you see the same thing, and God literally at the end of Genesis 1 moves in.
Mm.
And he's created humanity to be the temple staff.
Mm.
And then that's even more clear in Genesis 2, The language that you would see in other religions is being used to signify, yes, this is God's house, not like the house of other nations that they use for their gods, but this one is a cosmic house. In other words, heaven and earth are one before the rebellion.
Mm-hmm.
So God dwells with his people.
Mm-hmm.
Now, the temple staff are not just some people who do what God doesn't want to do, and that's where the surprise starts already, is the temple staff turn out to be God's friends.
Mm.
So in the beginning, God created roommates.
Hmm.
And so already we're dealing with the language of household, and we're dealing with the language of friendship, and we're dealing with the language of purpose and design and meaning and fruitfulness, and taking care of things, but all in the way of doing what God does, not doing it because God doesn't want to do it.
Mm-hmm.
So there's this partnership in this household.
Yeah.
And God loves dwelling with the people he's created in his house that he's created.
Okay.
And so that's the beginning of the whole business.
Hmm. So would the original people reading this have picked
Mm-hmm.
up on that, or is that something we are we seeing that kind of in hindsight, or are they noticing right away, like, oh, this, because we've talked about Genesis 1 and 2
Mm-hmm.
being kind of the opposite of the other creation myths at the time.
Yeah.
Are they recognizing like this story as, oh, God's building a house and that's different in some way than
Mm-hmm.
Babylon?
Yeah, there's all sorts of reference points where the authors are shouting out to other creation stories.
Yeah.
But usually then they flip it. So this is a different kind of house.
Yeah.
But it's not unusual in a creation story for the deity or deities to build a house, and then humanity winds up being the staff of the house, or what we call the priests. And a lot of that it's described that way to make sense of what the priests are doing in the temple for those gods.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's all thinking in terms of ritual.
Mm-hmm.
And again, there are parallels with what the priests do in the temple and the tabernacle of Yahweh.
Mm-hmm.
But the unique thing is that all people are priests.
Mm-hmm.
All people serve in God's house.
Mm-hmm.
And that's unique. That's where I believe Moses in Deuteronomy refers to ancient Israel before they go to take the promised land, is you are a kingdom of priests. And they didn't mean they all dressed up in fancy robes and made sacrifices.
Mm-hmm.
What it meant is you are all belonging to God's household and taking care with God of his house.
And that's a very different role than what the other religions would have been, how they would have been placing humans in relation to the gods of whatever household they had.
Oh, yeah, because humans were designed to do the dirty work. So which means you're cleaning out the toilet, you're washing the floors, you're fixing the broken stuff, but you never sit at table with those gods because, you go eat in the back.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so, yeah, also the stories of creation were meant to establish hierarchies, where, again, our story is meant to establish that we belong in the Father's house. There's more than enough room, as Jesus says, in my Father's house.
Mm-hmm. So let's get into then the trees and the serpent in this temple, and just the fact that they're there.
Yeah.
How does that change or impact the idea of the garden being a temple?
Yeah.
That those are present, both in the story and in the temple.
Yep. What's interesting is, let's start with Genesis 1, where we have the two trees. Now, the tree of the knowledge of good and evil does not show up in the temples because it's a representative of us. In other words, we decide what is good and evil. It's the tree of us.
Say that again? The tree is not in the temple?
Well, in other words, if you start looking at temple art, and if you were to go into the most holy place, that's the first room in the temple that a priest would enter. All the curtains, everything is made of textile. They have woven into them trees and fruit and just everything you'd find in the Garden of Eden. And it was supposed to represent that the priest is in Eden. This is the Eden place. And likewise, in the most holy place, the Holy of Holies, you get the same kind of textile art. Now, also with it is art to symbolize something has gone wrong, thus the necessity for the temple. and that is both on the curtains into the holy place, the exterior curtains, and then the curtains into the most holy place. You have two angels
Mm-hmm.
that are seraphim, and they're guarding the place.
Mm-hmm.
And where there would be a flaming sword in the middle, out in the exterior, is the altar. And with a Holocaust offering, you'll see a flame that goes up quite high,
Mm-hmm.
like a flaming sword.
Mm-hmm.
And then the incense altar, you don't have flames, but you have smoke. Um, and many times, smoke is a symbol of the presence of God. But the point is that something is guarding the doors.
Mm-hmm.
And we know that when our first parents rebelled and they were given a timeout from heaven,
Mm-hmm.
or a timeout from Eden, more accurately put, then there were two seraphim, and there was either a sword of flame or a flaming sword,
Mm-hmm.
however you want to translate it, guarding. And that's so, I mean, actually also for humanity's protection, that they didn't become eternal evil.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and, and, and and it didn't hurt that we weren't being merely prohibited from eating from the tree of life. We didn't want it because we thought we had our own life.
Mm-hmm.
So that's why the tree of the knowledge of good and evil doesn't show up in art in the actual temple and tabernacle.
Oh, you're talking about okay, so the tree doesn't show up in art in the tabernacle.
Hmm.
I thought what you said was the tree is not in the garden.
Oh, yeah, definitely in the
Okay,
garden.
that's where
Sorry
you
about that.
lost me. I was like, okay, gotcha. Um, all right, so after the
Hmm.
garden, then
Hmm.
where does the temple theme go?
Yep.
Where's it go next?
It actually, what we get is God continues to be with his people. So the people are not living in the heaven and earth place anymore,
Mm-hmm.
but God has not abandoned them.
Yeah.
So we see this with Cain and Abel. Is God's trying to stop Cain from doing stupid stuff?
Mm-hmm.
He says sin is crouching at your door, just like the snake was.
Mm-hmm.
But you can master it.
Mm-hmm.
In other words, there's a way out for you if you want it.
Mm-hmm.
Well, nah. He goes and does the snaky thing, just like his parents did.
Mm-hmm.
Kill someone this time.
Yeah.
But then God keeps showing up. All the way through, God shows up with Noah, and he saves the planet, curiously enough.
Mm-hmm.
Then God keeps showing up all the way. Then we see Genesis 11, where God intervenes and ends the construction project, where humanity is trying to build its own Eden temple.
And that's Tower of Babel.
Yep. Mm-hmm.
Yep.
And God says,
Yeah.
You won't find me up there.
Yeah.
And then, curiously enough, we start the downward direction that tends to propel the story from there, where God comes down to an obscure couple and says, I will make your name great. You can't make your name great. That's a bad idea.
Mm-hmm.
Your parents, way back then, tried that with the tree of the knowledge of good and evil.
Mm-hmm.
But I will make your name great. So we have the tree of life symbol. The tree of life comes to these people.
Mm-hmm.
The journey is a very imperfect one, and humans seem to try to mess it up as they go along.
Mm-hmm.
But then you get to Joseph, where it keeps saying, then the Lord was with Joseph. Or the Lord was with Hagar, the God who sees me, Hagar says. The Lord wrestles with Jacob.
Mm-hmm.
So on and on and on, we see God's constant presence. And it continues, and then God hears the cry of his people in Egypt, raises up Moses to deliver the people, and then, this is great, I love this, God decides to move in with his people.
Mm-hmm.
And to think of moving in is not like, well, I'm not here and I got to get there. We're not talking about limits on God. We're talking about issues of intimacy and how much God desires his people. And they're a mess. As God is giving Moses the blueprint for his tent, and by the way, they're on Mount Sinai, which is like the screaming Eden symbol, where I love it. Moses has a commuter relationship. Moses commutes to work up there several times.
Yeah.
But it's more than just commuting to work. That's where his friend is, God.
Mm-hmm.
And so he and God together are doing what God planned all humans to do all along, is they're designing stuff and taking care of stuff. Well, while the blueprints are being drawn, there we got the Golden Calf affair down right below the mountain. So one more mess up, it creates a civil war, lots of people die. But what's God's response? How does a holy God respond to godless sinners?
Mm-hmm.
By still building the tent, still building the tabernacle.
Mm-hmm.
Says, I am bound, determined, and stubborn to move in with you guys, even if you guys don't like the idea.
Yeah.
And so you can see God's stubborn love. So he's constantly coming down to people who are not even sure they want him.
So it's something you said in there, like right after Adam and Eve are kicked out of the garden.
Mm-hmm.
Um, I don't think I've ever realized this, but if God, if the garden is the temple,
Mm-hmm.
and so where God lives,
Mm-hmm.
and He's kicked us out, He doesn't stay where he's leaving as well.
Mm-hmm.
Is
Mm-hmm.
that accurate to say, like, if as we get kicked out, He
Mm-hmm.
also goes with, he
Yeah.
doesn't stay in the garden and just say, like, come back when you're cleaned up.
Yeah. Yeah.
He
Yeah.
goes, he takes it, as you said, takes the time out with us,
Yep. Mm-hmm.
and follows us through that, quote unquote timeout. Um,
And then that comes to climax when Jesus is one of Jesus's nicknames is Emmanuel, the
hmm,
God who is with us.
yeah.
So here and it's no accident that John writes, when he talks about the Word came flesh and tented among us,
Mm,
and uses the word that Jews use for the tabernacle.
hmm.
Um,
So would it be accurate to say, like, right as God kicks us out, He also moves the temple because He moves where He's located, where He is.
yes, I had never thought about it before, but um, maybe I would use more technically. The temple presence goes with people as they leave the temple.
Yeah,
He doesn't abandon them.
yeah.
And the point is the presence. The temple is a result of what God has done to create space for Him and humanity,
Hmm.
and everything else. In other words, out of God's overflow of love, He creates,
Hmm.
and the result is creation, including us.
Yeah.
We reject that, but God does not reject us. So already we're beginning to see the impulse that will climax in the cross, where the final rejection by humanity and the final insistence of love, or not the infinite insistence of love on the cross.
Hmm.
And so the temple represents that insistence that you cannot stop me from loving you.
Yeah.
It also is that, again, God doesn't want us to climb up to His house. That was the problem with the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, is the devil talked our first parents into believing they had to keep climbing,
Hmm.
and they were already where God was. So
Hmm.
why do they have to keep climbing?
Hmm.
And that's often, you think of that in psychological terms, most of us are discontent with who we are.
Hmm.
And we keep trying to change things about ourselves that actually are part of our identity
Hmm.
that we can't change.
Hmm.
And often we get stuck into fits of self-loathing and whatever because we can't climb the ladder high enough.
Hmm.
And God's like, get off the ladder.
Yeah.
I'm down here.
So this whole temple theme,
Mm-hmm.
like, so we've talked before, I think you've called it the Aristotelian way of thinking
Yeah.
of God in the omnis. So the
Uh-huh.
omnipotent, omniscient, omnipresent, like all those things,
Mm-hmm.
that God is all knowing, all
Yeah.
powerful, He's everywhere.
Yeah.
Um, that tends to be a very Greek way of thinking about
Mm-hmm.
things, or
Yeah.
post Enlightenment are all those kind
Yeah.
of
Uh-huh.
accurate.
Yeah.
And so if this temple theme is like basically locating where God is,
Mm-hmm.
but the omni way of thinking about thing is,
Mm-hmm.
well, God is everywhere,
Mm-hmm.
which is, as I've heard you say, not incorrect.
Mm-hmm.
But if we think about God as everywhere, which again He is,
Mm-hmm.
then we lose the temple theme of locating Him specifically in different spots more than others.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if that's probably not the right way to say it, but does that make sense? Like, help me. Are
Mm-hmm.
we missing this temple theme because we think of God as, well, he's just everywhere, so he's not, we don't need to locate Him. Does that make sense?
Yes, and I would say using Western language about God, we often lose the sense that God is with us.
Yeah.
It's for example in my preaching class in seminary, if you say God is love, often then people compare themselves. Then I don't measure up. But if you say God loves you, that changes the game.
Mm-hmm.
So if you say God is omnipresent, so what?
Mm-hmm.
If you say God is with you, that changes the game.
Yeah.
So I want to just address my objection against those the three omnis. is it's not, as you say, they're not wrong-headed. They're just not adequate to express what's really going on. They're too small.
Mm.
I mean, again, Jesus is the most radicalized version of the temple.
Mm-hmm.
He calls himself the temple.
Mm-hmm.
And so Jesus also will talk about his heavenly Father, and also the Spirit.
Mm-hmm.
So there's this sense that God exists three different ways simultaneously.
Mm-hmm.
So if you think of the Trinity as our ground for talking about God's attributes, so if God can exist three different ways simultaneously, then it makes sense that Jesus could be in a boundaried location and also as God be everywhere.
Yeah.
So then the question is, what's his presence for as Jesus or in the temple? In other words, why would God locate himself in a specific place in a unique way?
Mm-hmm.
And there's a Lutheran slogan called "Presence with a Purpose." It's a little trite, but it works. And it's used to explain the sacraments, where Christ's presence is in a unique way in the Lord's Supper, in baptism, and in the preaching of the Word. I would say that when you think about it, for me, the language of home and family, that Jesus uses that explicitly, or we talk about in the image of God, so there's a sense of doing things with God rather than for God all the way through the Genesis stories.
Mm-hmm.
This is language of friendship, of intimacy, of family, of home, not just a house, but a set of relationships that get located in a place, a space for relationships.
Mm-hmm.
And so when and so we have this sort of interim period before the tabernacle where God's presence keeps showing up with God's people, whether they like it or not, or know it or not.
Mm-hmm.
And then when the people are together and God wants to draw them into greater intimacy, and part of that is he has to reteach who he is, so hence Torah, and that's one thing that comes from Sinai. And the second thing that comes from Sinai is temple.
Yeah.
And so so temple is to function to tell us that God has chosen to dwell with us. He has moved in with us. But yet, because there's a holy place and a most holy place that only the priests can go and only the high priest can go to the most holy place, that's to let us know something is still wrong.
Mm-hmm.
That even though God is pursuing us, there are barriers that must be overcome. And then the sacrifice system begins to tell stories of how God overcomes those barriers.
Yeah.
So in that way, the temple as a building with all its artwork and symbolism is like a sermon of what's the matter and what's God done about it and what's God doing right now about it.
Mm-hmm.
And which to me is just amazing. So you've got this little, sermon as building,
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So earlier I'd talked about temple being a lot of people thinking about Solomon starting there,
Yeah.
about temple being the building, and you've reframed it to it's God's house. But we've also got this temple and tabernacle, which we've been kind of talking about.
Yeah.
My understanding is the tabernacle is, it's the mobile temple,
Right.
right? It's just where God's house is that can move. And you've now talked about the symbolism and stuff. Tell me more about, like, if we were to walk into the temple or the tabernacle.
Yep.
What would we see? And you've said, like, there's a lot of storytelling in that. And why is God so detailed in how to
Yeah.
build it? Because the people who like read through the Bible, oftentimes when they get to all these measurements and this specific things about how to build things, they get a little lost in that. But, like, why does that matter as well? So kind of those two questions: why do the details matter, and what would it look like to walk in?
And why is it the great snore? In other words, I confess to have slogged through the temple details and gone, oh, when is this going to be over? And Bible Project to the rescue. So I do suggest, if you want to go into detail, use their resources. It'll keep you from sleeping. But there's a reason why one is it's God's house. He wants to use the architecture and the art of the temple, along with its rituals, to describe what God had intended all along, to describe what has gone wrong, and to describe what God is doing about it. So if we walk in, the first thing we'll notice is this big, huge textile fence around the whole thing.
Mm.
And there's an entrance, and you have to prepare yourself to go into that entrance. And so there's a set of cleanliness rituals.
Mm.
And the reason, again, we've talked a lot about that, is to be unclean is to have death on you in one way or another, either through sin or through circumstances, like if you touched a dead body. And so then you go through a ritual where you reflect on uncleanliness, death. Then you literally go through your own Red Sea. So think of death as Egypt. You dip yourself in a mikvah, which is a big basin of water, and that symbolizes going through the Red Sea. You come out the other side, and then a priest officially certifies you're clean. Once that's done, then you can go into the temple courtyard. Now, what would you see next? The major items you would see would be the temple itself. Again, it's a very large textile-looking building, and right in front of it would be the altar. Now, again, we talked about it, is the first thing you'd see is these big hanging textile curtains. They're probably about 6 inches, thick. So they're like textile walls. And then right in front of them is the altar. And this would look strangely like what you read in Genesis 3, where what guards Eden are 2 angels and a flaming sword. Now, we learn that that's not the last word. And it wasn't in Genesis 3, because God, as you said, kept remaining with his people even though they were no longer in Eden. So now, how do we access God in a symbolic way? And what's the story that's told? Well, we've talked about the 3 offerings, the 2 thank yous, and the 3 I'm sorry offerings. When you sacrifice an I'm sorry offering, either smoke or flame goes up in the air. And remember, the altar is between the 2 angels. So now what happens is, rather than this sword guarding the temple, the sword opens the temple symbolically. In other words, while laity still did not get into the temple per se, symbolically this granted you entrance to the presence of God. It made things right between you and God, and we've talked about that before, so I won't go into much detail. Okay, now the priest. The priest also has to go through cleanliness rituals to get into the holy place. Now, when you get in there, as we've talked about just a little while ago, you'll see all this textile art around the walls that looks like Eden. All these trees, all this fruit. And then you'll see on I believe the left side, if you were to turn to the left, you'd see a table with 12 loaves of bread. And then on the right side, you'd see what is called the menorah. And this is a candlestick with 12 flames. And the menorah shines on the bread, and this is a way of talking about how God's light shines on the 12 tribes of Israel, the bread meaning the 12 tribes. And so we have a sense that God's people, that God shines on his people, and his desire is for his people to live in the Eden place. Now, once again, we get a reminder something's gone wrong, because now the textiles to the Holy of Holies, one more time, 2 angels, and in the middle is the incense altar. And again, we said before, as well, that's not an actual flame, it does have smoke. And there's all kinds of subtleties to this one, because smoke can also be the presence of God. So there's the daily incense sacrifices, and these are sacrifices of praise. So this is intimacy. So the priest is symbolically being like our first parents and spending time with God. And then once a year, for the Day of Atonement, the high priest is allowed to enter into the most holy place, or the Holy of Holies. Once again, a cleanliness ritual, and then going into the throne of God. Now, this is fascinating, because the ritual here, there's twofold. One is all the sins of the people that year are symbolically placed on the scapegoat, one of 2 goats, and that goat is sent out of the camp to the desert, and one of the names of the desert is Azazel, which is also the name of the devil. So we send back the evil back to where it came from. The other goat is then sacrificed, and now this blood, this is fascinating, because of all the sacrifices and all our sin, they have symbolically messed up God's living room. and even sort of dumped on God's throne. So God's house is a little dirty because of our sin.
Mm-hmm.
So what has to happen? Well, someone who didn't dirty up the house needs to clean up the house, and that would be the other goat. So we take the blood in, and the priest then sprinkles the blood on the holy place and then the most holy place as a way of saying, spring cleaning time for God's house. We're going to clean it up again. And that's a way of saying every year that God's house, that we have messed up Eden.
Mm-hmm.
So we have turned Eden into the desert. Mm-hmm. So we're going to, blow out all the sand that's crept in,
Mm-hmm.
And all the weeds and whatever. So we get these rituals that sin is ongoing, that God is ongoing in his desire to clean it up, and his representatives are the priests who do what God will do and is doing.
Mm-hmm.
And so we get these constant stories. And okay, here's what gets really crazy. So we've talked about the Holy of Holies being God's throne room. So the base of his throne is the Ark of the Covenant. And so the base of his throne contains manna and also the Ten Commandments, so that symbolizes God's, unbreakable covenant with his people and his people's response to trust God. The people's side doesn't always work.
Yeah.
And then there's two, I believe, cherubim who are guarding God's throne. Now, all this architecture has similarities to pagan temples. But once again, God's going to flip the script.
Okay.
And so where a pagan temple would have a statue of the god either sitting or standing, in God's throne room, there is no image of him. You know why? Because his people are his image. And so, which once again throws us back to, if you want to see something that looks like God, forget the artwork. You are God's artwork. That's why Paul says in Ephesians 2, we are God's masterpiece or work of art. And once again, you have in Psalm 139, we were fearfully and wonderfully made. We've been knitted. We've been woven. Art language. And so this is why God says, no idols. Don't make an image and bow down to it. Bad idea. Because you're my image. So that's what you would see in the temple, is not only the presence of the things I've described, but the absence of a statue sitting or standing.
Yeah.
Which is a paradox, because if you want to actually get really close, like you would in a pagan temple, you got to go back out of the temple and go hang with each other. And that's why loving your neighbor is an act of worshiping God.
Gotcha. So it sounds like, now I want to go back and read all the details of building of the tabernacle and everything, because it sounds like as you're reading through it, maybe just asking yourself, what's the story being told, and what does it connect back to, or what does it communicate? Because is really anything in those details just random, or it sounds like there's just a purpose for all of those details that we just gloss over sometimes.
Oh, goodness gracious. Yeah. Now, it is not, that's conceptually simple, but then, then you're wading into a big sea of stories. And some of them we have to really work to get access to, because we're talking about another culture, another time.
Yeah.
But I think it's worth it, because so you basically think of it as architecture as narrative.
Yeah, that makes sense. Okay, so I want to move into like David and Solomon. David wants to build a temple. God basically says no.
Right.
Solomon eventually builds a temple. Can you talk me through, like, first of all, why doesn't God want David to? It seems like building a temple would be a good thing. And then Solomon does, and maybe doesn't always go great. So let's talk through those two and how God's working through this temple idea, moving from tabernacle to temple.
Yeah. So as we know, both David and Solomon, their career is uneven. But so Up until the time that David gets it in his head to build a temple, and even beyond till Solomon, the tabernacle is still the place of meeting.
Mm-hmm.
Every now and then, if you read tabernacle, another term for it is the tent of meeting.
Mm-hmm.
It is the heaven and earth place where humanity and God meet together.
Mm-hmm.
And David, there's a point in his life where he's consolidated his empire, he's beaten down his enemies, and he builds himself just this crazy, huge, fancy palace.
Mm-hmm.
And one day, while he's sitting in that crazy, huge, fancy palace, he says, I got a really nice house. God needs a really nice house. And, and part of that is it's a vanity project to show off, the largesse of the king, or the fact that the king's got a boatload of money, and so won't God be impressed?
Mm-hmm.
Well, it's interesting that the prophet Nathan says, yeah, you go do that. That sounds fantastic. I love a good building project.
Mm.
Well, then Nathan has a dream from God, says, did I ask for a temple?
Yeah.
He says, no. And then he says, heaven is my throne and the earth is my footstool. In other words, why do I need a temple?
Mm.
But he says, but I will, give a house to David. David wants to give a house to me, but I'll give a house to him. And it's a flip on words because this house means the dynasty of David and his descendants.
Mm.
In other words, we talk about the house of David.
Yeah.
So in that way, and the other thing, there's another reason. It says, now you can't build a temple. You got too much blood on your hands, which means, David, you're unclean.
Mm-hmm.
And he's killed a lot of people, and not always justified.
Mm-hmm.
As in Uriah, Bathsheba's husband.
Mm-hmm.
So that kind of puts a pause on the things. Then Solomon picks up the project, and I can see God going, yeah, okay, I can work with that.
Mm-hmm.
And it's, by the way, that's a pattern where we do something for God that we don't need to, and God's like, why are you doing that?
Mm-hmm.
And God says, but I'll still work with it.
Mm.
So you see that God will go ahead and work through our stuff, even with our weird, messed up, mixed motives.
Mm-hmm.
So Solomon, he designs the thing. It's pretty well same blueprint as the temple, but now the tabernacle, but now it's out of stone.
Mm-hmm.
And there's some additions to it, but essentially the same architecture.
Mm-hmm.
It's just incredibly fancy and over the top. They blew their budget twice. Who knows?
Mm-hmm.
And they have the finest of wood, the finest of jewels, the finest of stonework. They put it together with, as we talked about before, conscripted labor, forced labor, which means slaves. Mm. So all of a sudden, the temple dedicated to the God who frees the slaves is being built by, you guessed it, slaves. Mm. Oops.
Yeah.
And the narrators they don't say it obliquely, but it's very clear that things are not going all in the best of directions. Mm-hmm. Temple's finished. And then Solomon does his big dedication prayer, but he keeps saying about how I have built this with my own hands. Mm. And that's repeated several times in the prayer, which should make you uneasy.
Yeah.
Now, again, God often just works with what he's handed. So he shows up with Sinai symbols, clouds and I think lightning, and pretty well forces the temple staff out of the temple. Mm-hmm. So very clearly making sure, yes, I will make this my house. Mm-hmm. And so God is with his imperfect people and with an imperfect king. Now, I wish the king had gotten the memo, because the king doesn't realize that that's a grace moment. And it says Solomon from there on begins to be so full of himself. He has all these treaty wives, and when you marry a treaty wife, you also adopt their religion. So he starts sticking all these little shrines in and around the temple. To all these various gods of all these various countries he has alliances with, polluting the whole business. Mm-hmm. And David actually does a little bit of that as well. Yeah. So all of a sudden, polytheism is alive and well, and we're supposed to worship Yahweh in the middle of that, and I suppose we do. Yeah. But we got all these other gods we're now worshiping. Yeah. And then there's these things that Deuteronomy very clearly says a king ought not to do, and they have in relationship to Egypt and enriching yourself, and Solomon does it all. Mm-hmm. His son sees that, and Rehoboam, his son, when he gets on the throne, Israel lasts for probably a whole 30 seconds before he goes and blows it up. Mm-hmm. And then we have the divided nations. We have competing temples where Israel has 2 temples, but God didn't tell them to build those either, and they have so much pagan influence. Mm-hmm. And then in the Jerusalem temple.
Yeah. So I wonder, as you're saying, you're describing there's this back and forth with the temple, and how it relates to
Mm-hmm.
Genesis 1, 2, and 3
Yeah.
about like so God's made this temple in Eden,
Mm-hmm.
and we choose to define or make it what we want it, not what
Yeah.
he wants it.
Uh-huh.
And that's appears to be what was happening
Mm-hmm.
with the temple as well, what David
Yeah.
was doing
Yeah.
to it. And so there's just kind of this back and forth, like roller coaster of
Yeah.
that continues.
Mm-hmm.
Um, is that, first of all, is that what like the prophets Isaiah and Jeremiah are going after in the
Yeah.
temple? Because like by that time, by their time, how are people understanding the temple? Is it completely, is the story basically destroyed in their eyes? Like they're not understanding it the way God meant it with the
I would
temple.
say it's very much distorted.
Yeah,
The nice thing is God just keeps showing up.
yeah.
So the temple itself is a symbol that you cannot drive God out of your presence.
Mm,
In other words, again, back to with our first parents, and God is even the God who is with Cain,
mm-hmm,
even though Cain is not real happy about it.
mm-hmm,
And so here we have the same thing because I would say what's changed is the temple is a place of intimacy, of friendship, of family, a lot of marriage symbols in there where God is husband to his people.
mm-hmm,
Um, and then it's also the place of reconciliation where the sacrifice, the sin offerings are reconciliation stories.
mm-hmm,
And so, but now when you start adding, dueling shrines, so now you've got all these temples of other gods in the temple courtyard and around the temple.
mm-hmm,
Um, Again, the pagan temples or the temples of the other nations, their narrative mythology was all about placating the god, convincing the god to do things. It's all transactional.
mm-hmm,
We've talked before about the best way to understand the religions surrounding ancient Israel is they were, like organized crime, and the deities were like, um, they were the godfathers,
mm-hmm,
or godmothers if they were female deities.
mm-hmm.
And so all of a sudden you get this transactional way of thinking that leaks into the way they understand the temple. And then what happens is that becomes magic thinking. And so when we get to Isaiah and Jeremiah, Isaiah is addressing, you're going through all these rituals and you think this is what makes you a holy people pleasing to the Lord. No, that's garbage, because then you go out and you extort the poor and you get into fights over loans, and you look for ways to make more money,
Mm-hmm.
and I don't want any of your fasts. I want you to fast from evil. I want you to fast from injustice.
Mm-hmm.
So that's that whole thing where it talks about, do right by your employees, don't oppress the poor, you know.
Mm-hmm.
And so over and over again, the prophets say, you know, keeping ritual will not keep you clean. Loving your neighbor as yourself will keep you clean.
Mm-hmm.
Specifically the powerless, the inconvenient, like widows, orphans, foreigners, and the poor.
Mm-hmm.
And that's what makes you unclean, is when you treat them badly. Jeremiah goes straight for the gut because he's constantly attacking a thing called the Topheth, which was in the valley of Hinnom where they were burning children.
Mm-hmm.
And he says, that thing is going to become the city dump, and all you priests who are taking part in the burning of children will get yourself burnt by a conquering army. And then he says, and by the way, that temple that you keep quoting like it's a magic thing where they says the temple of the Lord, the temple of the Lord, the temple of the Lord. Yeah, just repeating that ain't going to get you anywhere. That's not a good luck charm. You're saying, that's God's house. God will never let anybody destroy his house.
Mm-hmm.
It's like, you want to bet?
Mm-hmm.
In fact, he's not going to let someone destroy it. He's going to order them to destroy it because you have made it a pagan symbol by the way you treat it.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And which is shocking that God is going to destroy his own house because it is no longer serving the purpose it was meant to.
And that kind of continues all the way through Jesus, right? Like,
Mm-hmm.
is there anything different from what you just said by the time Jesus comes, and that how the temple is being used or viewed by the people?
No, we have the same problem Isaiah pointed out in Malachi, where they go and do their ritual but then treat each other badly.
Yeah.
Then you have the temple's desecrated at the time of Judas Maccabeus, and and then he cleanses the temple and rededicates it, and that's where Hanukkah comes from, or what is in the Bible called, in John especially, it's called the Festival of Lights. And then the temple has been radically rebuilt and expanded by King Herod, king of the Jews, but he's not a Jew. Oops. So there's a big question whether the temple is actually is it clean, and is God actually receiving the sacrifices and the temple worship?
Yeah. So when Jesus when he kind of drives out the money changers in the temple, and he says, destroy this temple and I'll rebuild it, when he, they're not realizing what he's talking about. I mean, he's talking about himself, but they don't realize that those things are they come with a lot of, I don't know, baggage, but a lot of backstory to both of those things.
Yep.
Because the temple has continually been desecrated and rededicated, and he's sort of, what I'm hearing, sort of doing the same thing.
Yeah.
He's getting him out and rededicating it, and then he's later on saying, well, destroy it and it'll be raised again. So he's kind of continuing that pattern.
Oh, absolutely. In fact, I think you've said it rather well. So what he's done is he's telling a story, and it starts with the triumphal entry. And he kind of riffs off of Judas Maccabeus, but a little backwards. And he's God; he can do what he wants. So he does the triumphal entry, which would have happened after the cleansing of the temple. And that's where, after the temple was cleansed, Judas Maccabeus gets on a big war horse, marches around the temple, everybody waves palm branches and says, Hosanna, Hosanna, Hosanna. Well, Jesus enters the city, not on a war horse, but on the equivalent of a VW, or, a Golf, a colt, so a sterile donkey. I think that's right. So this is a very strange warrior. And then he goes in and does what Judas Maccabeus does and cleanses the temple. What is he cleansing it of? This case, not a pig that the pagan Antiochus Epiphanes put in there, but the money changers extorting money, and all the ways that the temple has been corrupted. Interesting, if you look at the parallel symbolism, so he's cleaning out stuff that, it's a reference to pagan King Herod, who remodeled the whole thing. But it's also a reference that the priests have become also pagans in the way they treat the temple by extorting the poor, which is fascinating. So he puts them in the role of Antiochus Epiphanes, and what they've done is, the sacrificing of the pig by Antiochus Epiphanes was referred to as an abomination. And so he's putting the priests in what they're doing is an abomination, and they have defiled the temple. They're saying, by what authority to do this? And he says, well, my Father's house is supposed to be a house of prayer for all people, but you've made it a den of rebels. So you can tell, and once again, the priests were the very people trying to stop the rebels by making nice with the Romans and constantly compromising the temple in favor of the Romans, even compromising theology. And so he's saying that makes you no better than the Romans, makes you no better than the pagan who sacrificed a pig in the temple. And then, and you are rebels against God. You're supposed to be the ones who create reconciliation. Instead, you create rebellion. And they're all, what? And then he says, and destroy this temple, and I will raise it up in 3 days. And, they have no idea what he's talking about. They think it means this building. And you notice, even if it was the building, Jesus didn't threaten to destroy it, as he was charged. He said, if you guys destroy it, I will put it back together.
So to kind of take it from Genesis to Jesus, God creates the temple, his temple, the way he wants it. We decide to make it our own. We get removed, but he goes with us. And continually, there's this tabernacle temple that is created that we then make our own. And God then, through Jesus, enters into our
Mm-hmm.
temple
Mm-hmm.
that we've created
Mm-hmm.
and suffers the consequences for the temple that we've created
Mm-hmm.
in order to build up the temple he wants it.
Yep.
Was an accurate
Oh, yeah, yeah.
arc?
And it turns out the temple we've created is actually the wilderness.
Hmm.
In other words, it's interesting that when God leads you into the wilderness, it's to meet him.
Hmm.
When we create a meeting place for God on our own terms, it turns out to be the wilderness and he's not there.
Hmm.
And what I mean by that is he chooses not to be found in our own idolatry. That's a desert. It's a self-created desert.
Mm-hmm.
Now, that doesn't mean he's not there. He's right there saying, I'm right here.
Yeah.
I'm not in that lie
Yeah.
because I'm the truth. So you will not find me in that false story.
Yeah.
And so that's Jesus. I mean, you think of the dripping irony is the one to whom the temple is dedicated is standing there cleaning out the temple. By the way, that's what the Old Testament says Messiah will do.
Hmm.
So Maccabeus was riffing on the Old Testament,
Mm-hmm.
and then Jesus riffs on both.
Mm-hmm.
So, but even more so, not just Messiah, but the one who gave the blueprints in the first place,
Mm-hmm.
of the tabernacle. And even more so, this is a case of where the temple presence, the actual temple is skin.
Mm-hmm.
It is a human being,
Mm-hmm.
who is all at once also the presence. So the glory and the temple become one in Jesus.
Mm-hmm.
And if the priests had a clue who they were screaming at,
Mm-hmm.
I wonder what they would do.
Yeah.
Now, John suggests that the reason they don't know is because of willful blindness. They have chosen to interpret Jesus as a blasphemer.
Mm-hmm.
So there is a sense of it's probably not possible for them to know it because they would refuse the knowledge.
Mm-hmm.
So which is a deep, sad irony, is the very people who are supposed to reveal God to his people have shut their eyes to God when he shows up.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so the temple was actually destroyed in 70 AD?
Yeah, thereabouts. Yep.
30, 40 years after Jesus.
Yep.
And I feel like sometimes that's not really understood or noticed
Yeah.
or
Yeah.
seen. Like
Mm-hmm.
it's maybe a historical event that we kind of
Yeah.
gloss over.
Mm-hmm.
Is there any significance to that and it happening, 30, 40 years after Jesus?
Yeah. If you start reading 1st, 2nd, and 3rd Peter, Peter refers to that as the visitation of the Lord or the Lord's appearing. For the longest time, I think people confuse that with the second coming. But when the phrase the Lord's appearing or the revealing of the Lord can also mean the Lord's judgment, like the day of the Lord, same concept.
Yeah.
And just to set things up, how this moves forward is during the exile, there was no temple. So the synagogue became the meeting place of God through his word. So Torah, studying Torah, hearing Torah, preaching on Torah began to take place of the sacrifice system. And so there was a debate in the first century where you had temple and synagogue. They were almost in competition with each other. Which one manifests the presence of God, Torah or the temple? And then Jesus is both Torah and temple. And that's no shock since God authored both. But if you reject Jesus, then your temple's destroyed, and that is the end of the world if you are a Jew. And then you're also driven off your land. That it's a capital offense after the temple's destroyed for any Jew to set foot in what the Romans call Palestina or Palestine. In fact, the term Palestine is a jab at the Jews where they named it after the people who occupied the land before the Jews. So it's like Rome's trying to erase the history of Jews by renaming it back to pre-Jewish origins. So once again, they're thrown back as for the synagogue being the place where the presence of God shows up. In fact, where they put the Torah is a special cabinet behind what looks like often a pulpit / altar. It's a big table where Torah is read. And so there's a lot of temple symbolism in a lot of the synagogues to this day. But there was a whole rethinking of Judaism after the temple was destroyed by the Pharisees. Basically, most priests were either killed or out of a job, so they no longer controlled Judaism. Now Pharisees did, and we get what we call Pharisaic Judaism, which is essentially what we have to this day. Depending on the brand of Judaism, Reformed Jews don't believe in a Messiah, and they don't believe in a temple, so they call their meeting places temples. And part of that was that the concept of Messiah kept getting Jews in trouble throughout the centuries because the language around a Messiah is political, and most kings didn't like that. And that was also very inconvenient for the church when the church became an institution. So in order to conform with society, the Reformed movement, which is, I believe, an 18th century movement, just started removing all the things that would offend a European state. And again, then you have also conservative Judaism, which did a little bit of that. So both of those are somewhat assimilationist movements. And then you have Orthodox Judaism, which attempted to maintain the Judaism of the Babylonian captivity. And then you have even more extreme, the Hasidim, and some of those would like to see the mosque, the Dome of the Rock, destroyed so they can build a temple. But our theology is Jesus, where did the temple go for Christians? Well, once again, it went among his people. So as the temple itself had no, statue, either sitting or standing in the most holy place, because the image of God was with his people, now the presence of God is with his people by the power of the Holy Spirit. And that's why both the Apostle Paul says several times that we are, God's temple, and so does Peter. And then in Revelation, the whole thing comes to completion. We haven't talked about that quite yet, but
we'll just get into that. Paul talks about then believers become the temple. Then in Revelation, God becomes the temple. Is that kind of, we talked about the democratization of the Spirit, of the Spirit being in all believers. And I would understand that as being the temple theme. So the church or the temple then scattered all over. But then in the second coming, bringing it, unifying it in one, like bringing the temple into one location again. Is that the flow of the storyline?
Yeah, but there's a surprise because the location turns out to be everywhere. In other words, you get this symbolism it's built on Ezekiel's symbolism of the temple, which is a perfect cube, and out of the temple flows living water. And then there are trees of life in Ezekiel's vision. Well, John multiplies that by 1,000, I think. So that big cube is honking huge. There's been lots of Borg jokes about that. Resistance is futile. You will be assimilated. And instead of us going off to heaven, which is a pagan vision, heaven comes back to us. So there's the downward motion again. And then heaven and earth become one, because the old heaven and the old earth pass away. And again, this is where when we think heaven and earth, we think of outer space and a ball, where what they would have thought is sky and land. And there's no more sea. What's that about? I like swimming, don't you? That's about there's no more chaos because the sea was a chaos symbol. So all the chaos is gone, and what is left is a renewed creation. And then I love this, and then there's no need for a physical building because God is present. And so not only is God present in us, but God is also now, God has localized himself once again for the whole world, not only in his people, but I would say with his people. So now, in the renewed creation, we experience the temple in and with us as a person, and that would be Yahweh. And there's, you see this where, Jeremiah says, I will make a new covenant and write, the word in their hearts, so no one needs to say to the other, you need to know the Lord. Everybody will know the Lord. And while that is fulfilled in Pentecost, in a certain way, it's completed at the second coming. And so all of a sudden, once again, all of creation now is Eden. And we are all where God designed us to be. And so, human history from the rebellion on to when Christ comes back is like a prologue to a novel with infinite pages.
Mm.
Now the story that God started can get back on
Mm.
game.
Gotcha. Yeah. Well, wow. We went all the way Genesis to Revelation there. So, anything else you would add to this? I feel like we covered a lot of ground, but we're kind of coming up on our time. And
Yeah.
anything you want to touch on before we wrap things up?
Yeah, just real practical. Often I think when we think of ourselves as having the Holy Spirit, we think of it as a little bitty piece of God that's been dropped into us,
Mm-hmm.
and kind of sweet and innocuous. Maybe it's our conscience that tells us when we've been naughty.
Mm-hmm.
Every now and then, we might get a prompting or a nudge, but so we've got God light.
Mm.
Um, let's go back to the Trinity again, about the fact that God is simultaneously everywhere and also was located in the person of Jesus, or
Mm.
in the temple, or in the tabernacle. The same thing is happening here. Is the Trinity, as Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, are not parts of God, but all of God at once.
Mm-hmm.
So then, if we are the temple of the Spirit, we have all of God in us as the Holy Spirit.
Mm-hmm.
And because Jesus also says the Father and Son will come to dwell with you,
Yeah.
make our home in you. So I think one of the things I would meditate on is, if I'm God's temple, what are the implications of that?
Yeah.
And again, God is still with me and in me.
Yeah.
And what does it mean to let that sink into your bones and not just be an abstract concept? And what are the Bible stories that show what happens when people say yes to that?
Mm. Yeah.
What's the impact?
Yeah. That's a good thing to think about. Well, awesome. I think that kind of wraps things up for
Yeah?
this topic and this season. So, again, before we wrap it up, be sure to submit some questions. We thank you for joining us today. Be sure to submit those questions and topic suggestions for the next season. You can do that by clicking the link in the description. That's linktree.com/wordofweb, and we'll talk to you next season.
You bet. Looking forward to it.